Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We're going to be looking at this recent phone call between President Trump and Vladimir Putin. The one that's been causing a real stir about the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, a lot of buzz around that call.
There have been some really strong reactions, especially in Europe.
Definitely seen some strong words being thrown around.
Some are even saying it's a betrayal of Ukraine.
Betrayal, huh? That's an interesting way to put it.
So we're going to try and unpack that a bit today.
Try to make sense of it all.
See why everyone's so worked up.
Right, and what it all means.
And figure out if this call really does mean things are changing in the conflict.
If this is some kind of turning point.
Yeah, so...
It really makes you think about what led up to this point.
Yeah.
If maybe this so-called betrayal was a long time coming.
Are you saying this whole war could have been avoided?
Well, maybe not avoided entirely, but it does make you think about the role of NATO expansion in all of this. It's been a sensitive topic for years. And some experts are saying it directly led to the tensions that, eventually escalated into this war.
Okay.
So maybe the West wasn't paying enough attention to Russia's security concerns.
So some missteps early on.
Potentially.
But this call still feels like a pretty big deal, right?
Oh, absolutely. A shift in the landscape, for sure.
It sounds like the U.S. might be ready to step back from the conflict.
Yeah, there's that sense of things pulling back.
So then what happens to Ukraine?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it?
If the U.S. isn't as involved?
Exactly. Who fills the void?
Yeah.
It comes down to the balance of power in the region. Who has the upper hand militarily?
Right.
And right now, Russia is in a strong position.
So if the U.S. steps back...
then that creates a vacuum.
And could Europe handle it alone?
That's another question we need to be asking.
Tough spot for Europe, then.
Definitely.
I've even heard some voices calling for Europe to step up their military support for Ukraine.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe even get NATO more directly involved.
Some are saying that.
Is that even realistic?
I mean, getting into an arms race with Russia, that's a dangerous game.
Yeah, and expensive.
Extremely. And there are those who think we need to find different solutions.
Like what?
Well, some are talking about revitalizing the OSCE.
The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe.
That's the one. Yeah, they're saying that could be a way to foster dialogue.
Okay.
Create a more stable security situation in Europe.
So moving away from this, head-to-head confrontation.
Right, more towards collaboration.
Okay. But we still have this immediate crisis right in front of us.
Absolutely.
Trump has said he wants to stop the killing.
Right.
So what are the chances of actually getting a negotiated peace at this point?
Well, that's tough to say, but depends.
On what?
Well, we need to understand just how devastating this war has already been.
You mean the human cost?
Exactly. The casualties are staggering.
Staggering how?
Well, the current estimates are saying over 1 million Ukrainian casualties.
1 million.
It's hard to even fathom.
And to put that in perspective,
Yeah.
That's more than the total number of American soldiers who died in Vietnam.
It's a tragedy of immense proportions.
It really is.
Yeah.
And to think it could get even worse.
If the fighting continues.
Right. What does all of this mean for the future of Ukraine?
That's a big question hanging over everything right now.
And some Ukrainian leaders are still hoping to join NATO?
Right.
But without U.S. support?
That's going to be a tough sell.
Yeah, so they're facing some tough choices.
Definitely.
So is there any reason for optimism here?
It's a complex situation, that's for sure.
Or are we looking at a pretty bleak outcome for Ukraine?
Well, maybe.
No matter what happens.
Maybe this crisis can force everyone to really rethink things.
Like a kind of reckoning?
Exactly.
It's a lot to think about.
A lot to unpack, for sure.
It's really kind of wild, right? Like this whole phone call between Trump and Putin, it's like it's stirred up all this stuff that was already bubbling under the surface.
Yeah, you could say that it's exposed a real rift.
Between how the West sees this war and what's actually happening.
Exactly. There's this gap between the narrative and the reality on the ground.
You're talking about this whole believers thing, right?
Yeah, the believers versus the pragmatists.
We've heard so much from Western leaders about this conflict.
Oh, yeah, tons of rhetoric.
Framing it as this black and white struggle, good versus evil, democracy against autocracy.
Right, but
the military analysts...
the ones looking at the actual strategies and the balance of power...
they've been saying this kind of thinking is dangerous.
Yeah, because it might not reflect what's really going on.
So are you saying the West has been, delusional?
Well, I don't know about delusional, but maybe there's a disconnect between the goals they talk about.
Like supporting Ukraine until victory.
Right, and the actual resources and strategies they're using.
Interesting. So what about Ukraine?
Oh, they're in a tough spot.
How are they reacting to all of this?
It's a mix. You've got some officials who are really upset.
Understandably.
Yeah, they're saying the U.S. is abandoning them.
And others.
Others are trying to project strength, vowing to fight on regardless.
But 1 million casualties.
More than double the number of American soldiers who died in Vietnam.
It's just unbelievable.
And let's not forget the Russian losses, too.
Right, they've been heavy as well.
Over 100,000 Russian soldiers killed.
Wow.
We're talking about losses on a scale we haven't seen in decades.
Like World War I.
Exactly. It makes you realize just how urgent this call to stop the killing is.
So stepping back for a second.
Yeah.
What happens if this war just keeps dragging on?
Well, it could get a lot worse. That's the scary part.
Worse how?
We could see a real escalation of tensions between Russia and the West.
Even more than now.
Absolutely. We're already seeing more military spending, and the rhetoric is getting more and more hostile.
That's a bit unnerving.
There's a real risk of this turning into another Cold War.
Or even worse.
A direct military confrontation between nuclear powers.
But that's a terrifying thought.
Yeah, it's not a good scenario.
And it's not just about the military stuff, right?
No, not at all.
What about the economic fallout?
Oh, that's huge. The global economy is already feeling the effects. Energy markets are in chaos. Supply chains are disrupted.
Food prices going up.
Exactly. And if this war keeps going, all of that will just get worse.
So with all of this going on,
Yeah.
is there any chance of a negotiated settlement?
I mean, it's possible, but it's so complex. There are so many different players and competing interests.
Well, Trump seems pretty determined to end this thing.
He said he wants to find a negotiated solution.
Right. So what's standing in his way?
One big obstacle is the lack of trust
Between
Russia and the West. They've been at odds for so long.
years of animosity and propaganda.
It makes it really hard to find any common ground.
And what about Ukraine?
Well, they want their territory back,
All the territory they've lost.
including Crimea.
But is that realistic?
It's hard to say. They definitely have the will to fight, but whether they have the capacity to actually win back all that territory,
Even with Western support.
that's a big question mark.
So you're saying they might have to make concessions?
It's likely that everyone will have to compromise to some extent.
But will they?
That's the million-dollar question. Are Ukraine, Russia, and the West willing to accept those compromises? That's what it all comes down to.
And that raises another question.
Which is?
Who really has the power to decide how this all ends?
Right. Who's calling the shots?
Is it the countries involved in the fighting?
Or are outside forces like the US and Europe pulling the strings?
That's a tough one.
It's this complex mix of internal and external factors.
No easy answers there.
Definitely.
This whole thing has really shown how our old ways of thinking about security just aren't working anymore.
Yeah, the old playbook needs an update.
Like, the current system is totally out of its depth when you've got so many different players vying for power.
It's like trying to fit square pegs into round holes.
So do you think there's any hope for a more peaceful world?
It's tough to say. I'm not sure about optimism, but
what?
maybe this crisis can be a wake-up call.
A wake-up call for what?
For all of us to reevaluate what really matters,
Yep.
what our values are.
And what we prioritize as a global community.
Exactly.
What can we do, like, as individuals and as a planet? How do we actually create a more peaceful and just world?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It feels almost impossible sometimes.
It's not easy, that's for sure. But maybe
What?
maybe the first step is trying to see things from other people's perspectives.
Even our enemies.
Even those we disagree with, most definitely.
So empathy and understanding are the keys.
Could be. It's all about building bridges instead of walls.
Building bridges to a new era in international relations. It's a powerful thought.
It is, and it's more urgent now than ever.
With all the challenges we're facing,
Climate change, economic instability, social unrest. It's a lot.
this deep dive has really been a sobering experience.
Yeah, it's heavy stuff, for sure.
It makes you realize just how destructive conflict is.
And how badly we need to find new ways to build peace.
We can't just sit back and watch the world burn.
We have to do so.
We have to choose dialogue over division, cooperation instead of confrontation.
And hope instead of despair.
It's a choice that will determine the future of humanity.
No pressure, right?
Well, this has been challenging, but also incredibly insightful. Thank you for breaking it all down for us.
It's been a pleasure talking about this with you.
And everyone listening out there, thank you for joining us on this journey.
We hope you found it worthwhile.
We hope this deep dive is giving you some food for thought.
And maybe even a little bit of hope.
Yeah, because it's easy to feel overwhelmed by all of this.
But we can't give up.
Keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep fighting for a better world.
That's what it all comes down to in the end.
This has been The Deep Dive.
Thanks for listening.
Subscribe to our podcast, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. You're here to make things clear. CSCIM.